So now we'll just wait for everyone to get here. Are you so just let me know when you got it on Facebook, Shahid. I'll put a watch party up on our page.
Yeah, it's going live to Facebook right now.
Awesome.
Also, because iftar is at 7:55, is that going to impact anything?
Iftar starts at 7:55?
I think so.
That's helpful information. I'll make sure that we are
Have,
done. Hey, I'm a preacher. I stand in between people in their lunch every day. I do not want to do that with Muslims after they've been fasting all day.
Okay, we're on Facebook Live. We're good.
Okay. Let me get it shared here. Yeah. With you in just a minute. All right. So we're ready to go, Shahid. All right. Thank you, sir. Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I was just telling our panelists, the folks we're going to be talking with tonight, Friday night's normally a horrible time to schedule this, but we're in the middle of a global pandemic. So what else would you do? We're glad to fill at least an hour of your time this evening. My name is Joel Rainey. I'm a pastor in West Virginia's Eastern Panhandle, just outside the Metro DC area, a church called Covenant Church. And what you're about to hear was actually supposed to happen on our church's campus tonight, as well as a nearby university called Shepherd University that's near us there. Obviously, we could not do that for safety reasons, but we do plan still to do that. Hopefully in October, we're going to see what happens with the pandemic and the subsequent restrictions and how much of this we can do in the fall. But we thought, why not go ahead and have the discussion tonight via Zoom? And so I'm delighted to just lead this conversation together. Again, keep in mind that's coming in person. Our friends at the American Muslim Institution, they'll let you know when that date is going to be. And I want to thank my friends there for trusting an evangelical pastor to MC this meeting tonight. And the purpose is really, it's inherent in the title, From Fear to Freedom. It is to clear up suspicion, fear, questions. I am certain that there are Muslim neighbors who are joining us tonight who have questions of an evangelical pastor, things that they maybe were afraid to ask. And you don't need to be afraid to ask anything tonight. We need to come to understand each other. I know that some evangelical brothers and sisters of mine have questions of our Muslim neighbors. And so we want to give you the opportunity a little later in the segment here to talk about that. I know even from my perspective, I did not have a lot of knowledge of Islam. I knew some Muslims from a distance. I didn't talk to them about their faith a lot, which really is more of a failure on my part as a Christian than anything. And then all of a sudden 9/11 happened, and most people who had no real connection with the Muslim world didn't really know what to do, except perhaps attach a suicide vest or whatever stereotype they already had built up in their mind. And that just simply drove our communities further apart. And the fact of the matter is, Muslim neighbors have been worshiping and living alongside of us since the founding of the country, and there's been a lot of fear that's caused everybody's liberty to erode. And that's what we want to talk about tonight, from fear to freedom. And so I have a new friend that I met just in December and an old friend that are going to join me tonight for that discussion. We're going to do this rather quickly. 7:55 is sundown, and I want to thank our Muslim friends for joining us on the very first day of their Ramadan fast. And as I shared earlier, I'm a preacher, so every Sunday I get in between people in their lunch. I promise you, I'm not going to hold up the Muslims from eating their dinner after you've not had any food or water all day. We're going to get through this and get done by 7:55. But for those in the room who might not be familiar with what Ramadan is, Huranessa Faryad, a good friend of mine from Adams Center in the Dulles Airport area of the Washington, D.C. area of Northern Virginia, she's going to share a little bit of that. Huranessa, thanks for joining us tonight. Adams Center's been just a champion for us. You may or may not know that the Eastern Panhandle is ground zero for the opioid crisis, and they have been one of multiple partners who have just sent their love and their resources to help us fight that epidemic. So I'm very grateful for them, very grateful for you, Huranessa. Take us away and explain a little bit about Ramadan and a little bit about how that affects you, what it means to you as a Muslim, and then perhaps even a little more about what that might be like in an epidemic this year.
Sure. Thank you so much, Pastor Joel. I'm so honored to be here today with a great panel. This is probably the first Zoom that I know everybody on screen. So it's really nice to see everyone. Ramadan Mubarak to everyone. Thank you, Pastor Joel. It's been an incredible 2 years working with you on the opioid issue there in West Virginia. And I'm glad to be one of your close friends in that work. And Shahid also from AMI, always doing great work. It's always great to see him as well. And Asma and Sahel as well. So Ramadan is a month of fasting, and I think a lot of people do know that, but a little bit of history behind it. My job at the Adams Center is I head the outreach and interfaith department at the Adams Center, and we get to talk a lot about faith and different aspects of our faith and what all of that means in retrospect to what we're doing in life and to other faith groups as well. So when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, started receiving revelation in the cave of Hira in Mecca, the first 13 years after he received revelation, everything in Mecca was about Tawheed, which is the oneness of God. It's training the people there about what it means to worship one God, how to get oneself closer to one God. The dynamics kind of shifted once they moved to Medina, and there after 2 years, that's when the verses of Ramadan and fasting were brought down, because now the Muslims were spiritually ready to take on anything that God was asking them to do. So that happened in Medina, and you know, it's interesting how in the month of Ramadan, happening over 1400 years ago, the fasting has not changed. We fast from sunrise till sunset, and then at nighttime we eat. We're not supposed to indulge in a lot of food. We're supposed to eat healthy, drink a lot of water, pray a lot, exercise, and get close to our family and community. That's the essence of Ramadan. And it's something that God has given to us to spiritually connect to Him and to those around us who really are important to us. That means everyone. It's not just our family, but also to help those in our community who are in need of help. And so during the time when we're fasting, we are supposed to refrain from food, from drink, from marital relationships during the daylight hours. And then all of that ends once the sun sets for the Muslim community. There is a hadith, which is a saying of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he says that the reward of fasting and for those who are fasting is between that person and God. And God specifically says that because the reward is so great that we don't even know what the reward is going to be. You know, we can say like when you do a good deed, you get 10 rewards or you get, 15 rewards or stuff like that. But fasting is one that God saved for Himself to reward for to His people who are fasting. So the reward in and of itself is going to be so majestic, so grand that I don't think I could even sit here and explain what that would be like. So Muslims are really looking forward to that reward when they're fasting. Ramadan has essence of personal growth as well on top of spiritual growth. We talked about the spirituality of getting close to God, praying, reading Quran, finishing the whole Quran during the month of Ramadan. But then there's also a personal aspect to it as well. We're supposed to actually better ourselves during this time and, get rid of bad behaviors that we might have and use Ramadan as a benchmark to start those changes. So let's say if we're not really diligent on doing our 5 daily prayers, or we're neglecting the rights of our parents, parents or our family members, this is the time to actually start working on those and build on those. And then once we're done with Ramadan, keep it going for the rest of the year and then for throughout our lives. So it's not just, breaking our fast and eating and not eating, but it's a lot of spiritual growth and personal growth. It's one of the pillars of Islam, and we know that, and worship, when we connect to this topic that we're talking today about religious freedom and what it means to be Muslim and Islam in America, it's definitely taking a different toll about worshiping. Ramadan fasting is a form of worship, but also affording people the right to worship their religion is also something that is part of worship in Islam. As a personal note, my family and I came to the United States as refugees from Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion, excuse me, I'm fasting, so I'm choking up on myself, during the Reagan administration. And, if it wasn't for his Refugee Act, we would not be here. We probably would not be alive. We would not be here to practice our religion the way we want to. And we have to really be cognizant of the fact that these things are embedded within our Constitution and our rights here as Americans. So we can take the ideas of the Constitution and we can take the ideas of religious freedom in Islam and see that they are so connected and they're so embedded into one another that we can really see how much both of them are actually supposed to enlighten us in making sure that we're affording those rights to everybody around us.
Thanks so much for that. And I know that you allowed me the honor of sending some greetings your way into the Adams Center.
Absolutely.
I meant every word. I know this is a really, Shahid and I were talking about this earlier, it's a really unusual year to try to break a fast. One of the things I'm going to miss tonight, we were going to break that fast with you. And the food is amazing. So it won't be during Ramadan, but if we can pull this off in October, we're bringing the lamb, man. I can tell you that. I'm really looking forward to that.
It's definitely a different time. We're not going to the masjid for prayers. We're not going to the masjid for iftar. At Adams, we were feeding over 500 people every night during iftar every night. And that was for free. Anybody can come, regardless of faith, background, whatever you wanted to walk in. People were coming in. And so now it's a different time. Our worship is different in that sense. And we're not going to the masjid or the mosque at night to pray our evening prayer. We're doing everything at home. But the essence of Ramadan is still there, and we have to really use this time when we're home and we're not really sidetracked by work and running around and travel to really hone in on that and really take the spirituality of Ramadan and our personal growth to an advantage.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing all that with the audience tonight. I do want to mention we've got a way for any of you who are participating to interact with us. One is the chat bar on the side of the Zoom screen. If you don't mind being identified, you can drop your questions in there. If it's for anybody on the panel, just write the question. If it's for a particular person, you can put Asma, Suhail, or Joel in all caps, or Huranessa, and then ask the question and we'll know it's for us. You can also send a text message to the number that's in the chat bar, 304-582-0070. Again, I do want to keep the commitment to finish on time tonight. So we may not get to every question, but even if we don't get to your question, it's going to give us a great baseline for the discussion we hope to continue in October. And I really want to get started with that discussion right now. So I want to introduce two folks. One new friend of mine, Asma Uddin. She's a religious liberty lawyer. She has argued on behalf of multiple religious groups, including fellow evangelical Christians before the United States Supreme Court. I recently got a chance to work with her a little bit more closely at the Aspen Institute in DC on a project she's working on there. She's the producer of a docuseries called The Secret Life of Muslims, might be interesting, and has contributed to publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and also the Religion News Service, Teen Vogue. I'm glad she's here to speak. Suhail Khan is an older friend of mine. We've known each other for a number of years. He's the senior fellow for Christian Muslim Understanding at the Institute for Global Engagement. So when we speak about religious freedom tonight, we don't want to just confine that to America. Suhail has dealt with this and the religious rights of minority religions all over the world. He was a former senior counselor to President George W. Bush during the Bush White House. He's currently director of external affairs for Microsoft and a rabid fan of Johnny Cash, which makes me like him a lot. So I don't know if it would be a better joke to introduce it with one Christian and two Muslims, or one pastor and two lawyers. I'll let you guys figure that one out. But I want to get started with Asma. Tell us a little bit about the book you wrote. And I have it here. We were planning on giving away copies at the in-person, and we still have those, and we still will do that. Although if you want to go to Amazon and buy it tonight, I'm sure she wouldn't mind. It's called When Islam is Not a Religion. And we'll be talking more about this in October. But for tonight, Asma, tell us what inspired you to write this book. And within that, also a little bit more about your work and how you've advocated for religious freedom for all people.
Sure. Well, thank you, Joel, for having me here today. Thank you also for co-hosting this, and to Shahid and the American Muslim Institution for their work, and Adams and Harnessa's participation as well. And thank you to everyone who came out. And I hope more people will continue to join us. So Pastor Joel had said, he said the title of the book is When Islam is Not a Religion, but there's a subtitle after that, and that is Inside America's Fight for Religious Freedom. And I think that the coupling of those two parts of the title really kind of give you an idea of what it is that I'm concerned about and what I wrote about in this book. So the first part tells you that I'm obviously going to be talking a lot about attacks on Muslims, although that title is a little bit confusing, right? Like, when Islam is not a religion. But the second part tells you that I'm looking at this question not just as a question that's relevant to Muslims specifically, but as its connection to all Americans. And that's the perspective that I come from. So the pastor said, I have worked on religious freedom advocacy for people of every religion and of no religion. And the idea is, beyond the fact that that's just a good, right? To be able to be consistent and to have dignity in the work that we do. But it also comes from a place of understanding that in order to protect religious freedom for all of us, for even one of us, we have to protect it for all of us. There's inherent consistency that it's not just some sort of nice, philosophical statement or even an ethical point, but quite frankly, it is the way that the law works. It's just the nature of a jurisprudence. And so once you kind of create this precedent where you're carving out exceptions to this right for one group, guess what? The way the law works is that when you move on to the next case, it doesn't really matter what the specific religion was that the precedent was applied in. What all that matters is, what did the court decide? And now once the court decided that, it can apply to any other religion and any other set of facts. And so I look at this in this book, or I'm like, look, there's like this increase in claim, right? There's like this idea that Islam is not a religion, that it is instead a political ideology. And the reason the people who are making this claim are making it is because they don't want Muslims to have religious freedom. The idea is that religious freedom is for people who are religious believers, who are adhering to something called a religion. And so if we say that Islam is not a religion, then that's going to cut out the, 3 to 7 million Muslims in America. And never mind this idea of depriving people of human rights doesn't seem kind of strange, even though the fact there's 1.8 billion Muslims across the world. And so that's what the book is about. I look at this, like, who is making this claim? Why are they making it? What are the legal ramifications, and how it impacts all Americans, and why we should all be worried about it?
Yeah. Wow. So basically what you're saying is, if government can come for one of us, they can come for all of us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so this is why we have to be. I did one of your earlier speeches that I watched, Asma, as well as I think it was chapter 10 in your book, that really grabbed me personally, because I thought this is where it's at. There's the legal question that you talk about. If the government can do it to one, they can do it to all. Contrasted against that is, I am less likely to sympathize with the religious rights of someone whose beliefs I don't personally share. That we're in a society now that the culture doesn't lend itself to allow us to do that. So I wonder if both of you, both Suhail and Asma, could address that for a minute. Number one, that sometimes religion does become political ideology. We know that Islam gets politicized in different places around the world. We also know that evangelical Christianity can be politicized. That neither one of those things delegitimizes the religion itself or the people who advocate it. But when those things happen, and I think this is what chapter 10 brought up to me, was it creates mistrust and fear and therefore a propensity for me to either not care or maybe even be ambivalent or even antagonistic toward people who follow another religion and their rights. And I don't even realize that I'm digging my own grave when I do that.
Right. Well, what I think was really interesting is that those who kind of set out to make this distinction between a religion and what they're saying is a political ideology, it's like, well, where exactly does one end and the other start, right? And
Right.
the very process of trying to parse that is in itself often a violation of religious freedom, right? Because it's essentially saying, well, if it's spiritual and if it's happening within the confines of your house of worship or your house, it's okay, but don't bring it into the public space. And so one of the ironies that I look at is that oftentimes the people who are most vocal in making this argument against Muslims are the ones who are advocating for their religion to essentially be implemented into public policy or to have very public presence. So it's kind of like, well, wait a second, why isn't that political? And it doesn't occur to you that by saying that religion shouldn't have this public element, that somehow it's illegitimate, don't you see that that's going to just come back to bite you?
Yeah, a civil, Os Guinness, who's an evangelical cultural influencer, talks about civil square, and that one necessary element to a civil square is you can't have one religion dictating how society is going to conduct itself. You got to figure out how to share the space. Suhail, you want to add to this? You got to unmute your mic there, buddy.
So thanks. So first I want to join Haranisa and Asma in thanking you and Shahid, Pastor Joel, in organizing this. And yeah, I wish we were out in West Virginia with you all in person, but I'm glad we could do this virtually. But to answer the question, absolutely, each of us, our ideologies, whether they be political or otherwise, are formed by, a multiple number of forces, whether they be our parents, our faith, our experiences. Maybe there might be life events. I do a lot of work with American veterans, obviously. An experience serving our country, particularly overseas, can really inform your politics. And so that's why it's so important that we come back to the Constitution and the fact that there is a framework that our country is guided by. And what we're talking about today, our founders saw it to put right into the First Amendment of the Constitution, that the government, just as you said, Pastor Joel, cannot hold up one religion as being an official religion, but it can't also deny others, particularly religious minorities, of their rights. And that's the genius of the framers and the Constitution, and that they embedded that right in the First Amendment. Now, there are times where those rights might bump up against each other, where we might have some close calls, and we see those decisions being made by the courts and by legislators, both on the state and the federal level all the time. And we don't always get it right. Our history, unfortunately, has many moments where we didn't get it right. But I'll say one thing, that, to quote Winston Churchill, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other possibilities. We eventually get it right. And that again, I attribute to not only the genius of the framers and the Constitution, but also the real heart that Americans have for fairness, for religious freedom, and for really treating the other as you want to treat yourself. And so that's where people like Asma, who have gone into the courts and fought for religious freedom, not only for one specific religious group, but for all, is so important. That as Americans, we adhere not only to our personal ideologies or our religious preferences, but to a principle, and that is that all people should enjoy religious freedom, the ability to express themselves, including in the public arena, as protected and guaranteed by our Constitution.
Yeah. Thanks for putting that way, Suhail. And I think one of the things you mentioned is sometimes they do bump up against one another, and that always becomes a delicate discussion legally as well as culturally when someone's religious conviction begins to infringe on somebody else's space. Now what do you do? And
right.
Then that creates a lot of fear. And we actually have a question here from a guy, from John, to any of our Muslim neighbors, because this is where some of this fear and I think misunderstanding comes from. And I really appreciate you guys being here tonight and just being willing to answer some questions directly. That there's an understanding that in the Quran that there are places where Muslims are directed to kill non-Muslims. How can how do you all interpret that? How are Christians not to fear being in the same space with their Muslim neighbor if something is going on? And then once you answer that question, there's another question about Sharia, and that's a complex question, I know, but I want us to explore that a little bit. But I just want to open that up for any of you just to address that question. There are some folks that are concerned. How would you speak to a Christian neighbor who had those fears?
Sure. Well, I'll let Asma chime in as well, but I'll just maybe start off by saying, first of all, Christians and members of the Jewish community, first and foremost, are held in the highest esteem within the Islamic tradition. They are, as described in Islam, as the people of the book, because just as Haranisa described, Muslims believe in the Quran as the revered revelation for all humanity that Muslims read and adhere to. We also believe that there were previous revelations in the Bible, the Torah, and others that may have been lost to time. And so we are very much in reverence of our Christian and Jewish brothers and sisters. The verses that John refers to in the Quran are specifically referring to verses during a specific historical time of war. So that was at a time of war, not a generic or general direction for all Muslims. To the contrary, Muslims are to uphold the rights of religious minorities in Muslim countries and to uphold the rights of all people, regardless of their religion or ethnic or other backgrounds in their everyday lives, whether they're minorities or if they're in charge of a particular country. Now, unfortunately, people get that wrong. And as humans, we are fallible. And so there's no doubt that many, unfortunately, we see today, many Muslims take those verses out of context to justify horrendous violence against both Muslims and other people, including Christians and people of other religions. And that should be condemned by all Muslims and people of real scholarship about Islam and Islamic teachings. I'll let others chime in as well.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Asma, you wrote an entire chapter in your book on Sharia, which was outstanding. So I can't wait to hear your response to this.
Thank you. Well, so first, before I get to Sharia, I do want to, second what Sohail said about the contextual analysis of these various verses. And I think for me, it's just like, it's sometimes startling to hear people kind of come at Islam and come at me as a Muslim from this perspective of like, well, you're directed by your religion to kill me or to hate me. And my experience of Islam is like so different from that. For what I was taught from day one, of not just what I was taught at home, but what I was taught in Sunday school. And yes, Muslims go to Sunday school. It was that, exactly as Sohail said, the people of the book, and that we believe in these other revelations and we believe that they were divine, right? So there's like this inherent sort of connection there, and an inherent legitimacy as well. This idea that these were the first receivers of the message, and that the Prophet Muhammad's message was meant to sort of essentially build on that, and that's why he's talked about as the last messenger. And so the entire sort of frame that I've existed in, and that my experience of religion and of Islam has been from this place of there's this inherent divine quality to these other religions. They are joined to us as people of the book. Many of the same stories that are in the Bible are also in the Quran. And so it's just sort of like, it's a huge gulf between that and somehow coming from a perspective of like, well, those are the people I need to hate and kill. Was like, not really, because we believe that you received the divine message before, before the Prophet Muhammad. And on the question of, Sohail also talked about the inability sometimes of people who are ruling Muslim majority states to implement these beliefs in action. But I think what's important is that we often hear about countries like Saudi Arabia. We hear about countries where there are these horrific violations. My parents are Pakistani, and I, as a religious liberty advocate, I have spent considerable time looking at religious freedom violations in Pakistan, including, for example, the horrible sort of set of blasphemy laws there. But I can also tell you that the research has shown that across the sort of 37 Muslim majority states, almost a quarter of them are religiously free. What the social scientist calls religiously free, meaning you have pretty robust religious freedom there. And then of the remaining Muslim majority states, 40% of them are repressive, but they're not repressive because they're trying to privilege Islam, but it's because they're just hyper secularist. You have, for example, Turkey before the AKP party, where all religions, including Islam, probably especially Islam, was cut out from the public space. And then of the remainder, where you have Islamist regimes, they don't really rule by popular or support. There's like this disconnect between the authoritarian style of government and what they're imposing on the people and what the people themselves believe. And so I think it's really important to understand that there's this full diversity, and what that shows me, and it should show others, that there's nothing inherent about Islam and it being a sort of a majority religion and oppression. It's really kind of that context, and some states have really kind of taken in a very different direction. So, you know, and Joel, you know, before I even got to the chapter in my book where I talk about Sharia, it was the beginning of the book, and the constant theme throughout the book, in addition to this idea that religious freedom for some is religious freedom for none, is the idea that when I'm advocating for religious liberty for all, that's not the same as essentially advocating for free for all. And I think that's a very, very important point for people to understand. I mean, look, even right now with everything going on with the coronavirus, there's been so many different like controversies about churches. Some churches want to be able to, you know, Liberty University was trying to reopen, and it was like they're trying to create this space that could honestly be life-threatening. But then the countervailing argument has been, no, the government has a compelling interest. It can come in, and where there's a threat to life and liberty and to safety and to health, the government can legitimately step in. And so similarly, when I advocate for the rights of Muslims, I'm not saying, well, they can just do whatever they want, including going around killing other people or putting anyone's lives in danger. What I'm saying is I just want an equal application of law, so that Muslims, just like every other religious believer, has broad space to practice their religion. But the second they begin to cross the line and they bring up a particular religious practice that poses a risk, the government can absolutely legitimately step in.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen that with this pandemic. Our campus has been closed since I think the last in-person worship we had was March 15th. And we're not just doing that because it's the law. We're doing it because it's the wise thing, and because, as you've said, government has made its case for why at this point there's a certain level of liberty that has to be restricted, and they're not singling us out. They're not singling out any particular religion. They're singling out size groups, because you just can't do that now because of transmission. You guys are doing something really interesting here, because there's a question that says here, does Sharia conflict with the U.S. Constitution? Because I know you guys are familiar with these stories that have kind of floated around the web and certain media outlets, that Sharia law is somehow always mutually exclusive from the Constitution, and yet both of you are attorneys licensed in the United States. And both of you, over the last 5 minutes, have repeatedly referred to the Constitution. So either one of you, just talk to us about that.
So I'll just kick it off, and then I'd love to hear Asma's interpretations as well. But, really, this is another kind of false conflict, or really just a paper tiger, as it were. My parents, like her Anissa mentioned, and I'm sure Asma's, chose to come to this country as immigrants 50 years ago, seeking religious freedom because of what the Constitution afforded to all people, regardless of their faith traditions. And so, it's not a matter of that we're trying to somehow replace the Constitution with some type of alternative view of the law, or alternative of a worldview. And so that's number one. Number two, it's very important to realize that Sharia is kind of a buzzword, and it's almost like, when a 3-year-old learns a bad word, he wants to say it over and over again. Sharia is not a code of law that you kind of pull off a bookshelf, blow off the dust, and begin implementing, on every aspect of our lives. Sharia is an interpretive body of law, of jurisprudence, that takes into consideration several aspects of real life, using very time-honored principles based on, of course, Islamic tradition, to really promote justice, fairness, and a society where everyone is treated equally. And I'll give you an example of where that interpretation is very contextual. In Islam, generally speaking, it's prohibited to give or take interests, what are called usury. And that has been, and that's not unique to Islam. As Asma described, whether it's fasting or praying to one God, these are traditions that were, revealed to our Jewish and Christian brothers and sisters, and Islam continues in those traditions. And likewise, there was a prohibition on usury. Well, my parents, when they wanted to buy their first house 40 plus years ago, were kind of at a hard place, because our society is, if you save up enough money for a down payment, you go to the bank, you get a mortgage, and you buy a house. Well, what do you do if your religion says you can't engage in an interest? Well, over 500 Muslim scholars got together in the United States to address this issue. And they said, you know what? The purpose of prohibiting interest is that we don't want rich people who have money to take advantage of poor people who don't. But when it comes to buying a home in the American context, it's quite the opposite. When you go to a bank and get a loan, it actually empowers people who don't have enough money to buy a house to get a house for their family. And so in that instance, the Muslim scholars decreed by majority that Muslims living in the United States are perfectly allowed to buy a home using interest, because it's not in a situation where the rich are taking advantage of the poor. So I just give that as an example of where Sharia is not a strict, 13th century code and unfortunately, again, many, including Muslims, get that wrong. But that's why it's so important that people who have real scholarship educate both Muslims and non-Muslims on what it is. But in the end, to me, what I want to embrace and what I do embrace is the U.S. Constitution. Asma?
Sure. So as Pastor Joel said, I have dedicated an entire chapter to this issue of Sharia in my book. And there's an obvious connection there between, or to me, there's an obvious connection there between that and this idea of when Islam is not a religion, right? This idea of Islam is something other than religion. And the reason being because there's this very sort of well-funded, extremely powerful, funded at this point up to $1.5 billion, extremely strategic and effective set of organizations and individuals that the Center for American Progress calls Fear Inc. And it calls it Fear Inc. because you make big bucks doing this, basically spending day in, day out propagating fear and hatred of Muslims. And the idea there, the sort of language they use, just like Sohail said, it's a buzzword, is like there's like this really scary thing, and then specific language is like this is like some sort of dominant political ideology that's going to take over and subvert the U.S. Constitution. So the fact that you've heard that those of you who have heard that, I'm sure there's many of you who have heard that, because unfortunately many of them are actually repeated by Christian leaders. It's because there's this industry that is basically dedicated to making sure that you hear that. And just in terms of their effectiveness, since 2010, 217 bills have been proposed in 43 different U.S. states in an attempt to limit the practice of Sharia. And it's sort of like interesting because for one of the places where this passed was a ballot initiative in Oklahoma, and the Muslim community there is like so tiny. And when you hear the way these people are talking about it in the news, and I actually transcribed one of these interviews for you in the book, it's like, well, do you think that there's an actual sort of risk of like a Sharia takeover in Oklahoma or in Idaho that attempted to pass this in 2018? And it's like, no, not really, but they'll say it's a preemptive strike. And so it just sort of like, it's interesting, but then what makes it even sort of more ludicrous is the fact that there's not an actual problem that they're trying to solve. It's not like there's sort of like a burgeoning like problem, like something that's small that they're worried about becoming bigger. It's that there isn't even a small problem. And the reason for that is, Sohail was talking about Sharia, sort of this all-encompassing concept. But there is a distinction there between Sharia as this idea of the social good, right? That we're all sort of setting out to fulfill God's big purpose for the world. The literal meaning being it's a path to the water being our source of sustenance. But the actual sort of rulings are termed something else, and they're called fiqh, which is just transliterated as FIQH, which is like the actual jurisprudence. Okay, you have this big idea of like serving God's will and the social good, and but what does that mean exactly? And so there are a range of schools of law, schools of thought, and then 4 major ones among Sunnis and 1 major one among Shias, where they actually come up with these derivations and they actually are in conflict with each other. And there's an understanding among these Islamic jurists that necessarily there's going to be dissent and difference because this is a human endeavor. It's not a divine sort of infallible sort of ruling that has come from the skies. It's like, we're just trying to figure this out and we're human and we're fallible. And so guess what? You can totally challenge my way of thinking about it, I mean, among scholars. And so therefore you see a lot of like this dissent and difference. So I think that's really important because I think that it is, as a buzzword, kind of perceived to be the sort of like this monolithic thing that's just like scary. And what we see happening in Saudi Arabia is what it's going to look like if you give Muslims some freedom here, when that's absolutely not the case. In fact, within the American context, the issue of Sharia is quite limited. It can never be something that interferes with sort of criminal punishments. And so there's no risk there of having thieves having their hands cut off. It's relegated to the civil space, and even there it's constrained very, very tightly. So for example, even if you can sort of arrange for matters of inheritance and divorce and marriage using Sharia precepts, oftentimes child custody is an issue that's taken out of that because there's a greater state interest, in advocating on behalf of children. And then even for cases like marriage and inheritance, where you might go to an arbitration panel, and that's the way this works, right? It's like there's somebody who's skilled in Islamic law who's going to help you sort of figure out your dispute. And it's for the people who want to be able to figure out their disputes in relation to Islamic tradition. Perhaps you use Islamic tradition to write your marriage contract, which, by the way, is quite protective of women, more protective, in fact, than sort of the default American law. But even that decision that the arbitrator hands down, before you can enforce it, you have to take it to a secular civil court. And that judge, the secular civil court judge, has to check it up against American public policy and American law. And only when it comports with both of them will the court actually enforce the judgment, enforce the ruling. And so I think it's important to understand there's like this whole process and all these checks and balances and safeguards that go into this whole process. And you might be thinking, well, why bother? Why not just cut it out completely? And that kind of goes to the question again of religious liberty, of the fact that we understand that religious liberty entails giving religious people, the ability to be able to negotiate their personal matters and their disputes according to their religious tradition. And it's by no means unique to Muslims. In fact, I think far more than Muslims, it's actually the Orthodox Jewish community in this country that makes use of their rabbinical courts. And we also have some Christian groups that require, for example, the Promise Keepers require that any of their vendors bring their disputes to their internal dispute resolution mechanism, as opposed to going and litigating that in a secular court. And so it's by no means unique to Muslims. It's not even unique to religious communities. It's just a part of freedom of contract, and it's nothing to be scared of.
I'm glad you brought it around to that. So the whole time you guys are describing this, what I'm thinking about is, you're looking at a Christian who practices that. In Matthew 18, in our Gospels, there's ways to settle a dispute. There are other places in 1 Corinthians 6 even where if it's a civil issue, you need to avoid at all costs going before the secular authority, because you bring shame upon the name of Jesus if you drag your internal mess. Try to handle that internally. And we too, when there are certain issues of criminal intent, for example, domestic violence, certainly the abuse of children or something like that, we would immediately report that to the authorities. But there are other issues where there's conflict, where there is what Christians would consider sin. So for example, it's not against the law to cheat on your spouse in the United States. You can't go to jail for that, but you can get kicked out of our church for that if you don't repent of it. And so a lot of what you're describing is it's what Muslims as a community agree together. This is how we're going to relate to each other. Would that be a good analogy to just prescribe, to say Sharia is basically in the Muslim world what we would call church discipline in the church world, both formatively and reformatively?
I think there's definitely an element of that. One of the connections that I made in the book is, so one of the cases that I worked on when I was at the Beckett Fund, where I was a lawyer for 7 years, there was a case that we took to the Supreme Court dealing with a ministerial exception. You might have heard of it, the Hosanna Tabor case against, it was a Lutheran school, where there was a teacher there who was fired, and she basically threatened to sue the church. And the church said, well, no, according to, our teachings, you have to resolve this dispute within our internal dispute resolution mechanisms. And she still went to the EEOC, and this came all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, when it comes to these sort of religious questions, for example, who is religiously qualified to be a teacher or to be a minister, right? Minister is defined broadly as people who have important religious duties. That is something that needs to be decided internally, because if the courts get involved, they get to decide who your Sunday school teachers are and who your pastors are. And that basically means, state control of church doctrine. And there's actually two cases, just so you know, to make this super timely and relevant. There are two cases right now, they're consolidated. They're being heard at the Supreme Court. Oral arguments are actually going to be happening by telephone because of coronavirus. I filed a brief in there based on my book. And so that's actually going to be on C-SPAN. I think it's either May 6th or 9th. I don't have the exact date right now. But this is actually, there was the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals actually decided to interpret that Supreme Court ruling very narrowly. And so next thing you know, now we have this case back at the Supreme Court, where they're going to be going into more sort of detail and determining who, how do we define who constitutes a minister, and what is the sort of parameter around which courts can and cannot get involved in these religious decisions.
Yeah, and it's like I say, unless it starts to butt up against a civil society, a body of law where something's going to get violated, they tend to default toward the religious body's own rules. What are your rules? What have you set up to do this? And they give you the freedom to do that. I have a question here about how can religion coexist or occupy the same space as secularism? That's a complex question. I'm going to answer that because it's directed at me. I'm going to answer that just really an almost oversimplified way. And I'm going to go back to Os Guinness, Christian social critic, who says you can have three models for a public square. You can have a sacred square where religious values dominate, but typically what happens there is you're going to eventually have a battle between competing religions. And I don't think that's healthy as an evangelical Christian. When we argue about 10 Commandments, when we talk about the Bible being put the Bible back in schools. I think it's a great sentiment. I love the Bible, but I believe it's the Word of God. I think putting a teacher of any religious background in a classroom teaching a mixed group of students of various religions the Bible's probably not the best idea. And so when you talk about that, a sacred public square, you can't maintain that peacefully and still have people of various religions, because I think our friends would appreciate me being clear about this tonight. We're not trying to pretend we're all the same here. Our Muslim friends are about to celebrate the holy month on their calendar. They believe things I do not believe. I believe things they do not believe, and we don't think that they're no big deal. We believe they're very serious differences. And many of my closest Muslim friends would love for me to become Muslim, not because they hate me, but because they care about my soul. And as an evangelical, I feel the same way about my friends that I'm looking at tonight. I'd love to baptize all these people. And when I say that, I think they know my heart in that. It's not to try to get into their space, but it is to just emphasize the nature of a sacred square is you just can't say, well, we're all the same, so let's all come together, because it's just not true, which means if you're going to have a sacred square, it's going to have to be dominated by one religion or the other. That's not healthy to a pluralistic society, as the Constitution would envision. But the other extreme is a naked square, and that's what sometimes gets called secular. Secular just means it's the opposite of sacred. That's the word just means there's nothing sacred. And I think any person of faith, I would think Muslims included, would say, well, there's nothing created by God that's not sacred in some way. And so the naked square means we're just going to strip religion from the public square at all. You can't talk about it anymore. Well, that's not going to work for me, because as a follower of Jesus Christ, as an evangelical, he's my life. I have to talk about it. He's central. And I'm sure many of my Muslim friends would say, Islam is central to my core identity. I can't not talk about it. We can't just strip it from the public square. So Guinness says what we really need is a civil public square, a place where you have the freedom of exchange, you have the freedom and the adult maturity to understand that you're not always going to agree, that at times, even for the perceived good of the other person, you want to challenge their belief and call them into your own, but you want to have that respect while recognizing those differences and allowing for the freedom. So I don't think that the short answer to the question is no, I don't think secularism and religion can exist in the same space, but I don't think that's what the founders envisioned. as an evangelical, I don't believe that. I think what they envisioned was a plurality of worldviews existing in the same space. That's pretty advanced citizenship, but I think that's what they envisioned. And I think to a large extent for the last nearly 240 years, we've managed to pull it off. Let me ask you guys one other thing. We're getting close, and I do want to honor the time tonight. But Asma, you point out in your book the idea that just going back to this idea, Islam isn't a religion; it's a dangerous political philosophy. So, in other words, it's this Trojan horse that's kind of come into our country, which I think we've already kind of cleared the air. That's not really true. Muslims have been with us. They fought in the revolution. They've been with us since the beginning. But that it's a political philosophy disguised as a religion. And you gave actually in the book several examples of right-wing expression of that. So let me ask you, is this exclusive to the right wing, or are there some left-wing versions of this idea? And even I would say to Suhail, are there examples not just of the right, because I know a lot of what we've talked about tonight comes from the right, of people on the political left that would really use the Muslim community rather than protect them? Can you guys speak to that a little bit about what you've experienced?
Sure. If I could start, I mean, this kind of ties for me into that question that you just asked about the coexistence of secularism and religion. Because it was interesting because my former colleague, Luke Goodrich from the Becket Fund, he came out with a book just a couple months after mine came out. It's called Free to Believe. Actually, I have a copy right here. You guys are interested in checking it out. It's actually written for an evangelical audience. And he's got this line in there that I thought was really interesting. And it was interesting because I was reviewing his chapters when we were writing it, and he was reviewing mine. And he said, this idea, he actually addresses this idea of Islam, this claim, Islam is not a religion. And he's like, he gets all these different reasons for why it's a horrible idea for any Christian to go along with that and to support that idea. But he said, one of the reasons being that in our current context, our current sort of political context, he said Christianity is more likely to be deemed a dangerous political ideology much more quickly than Islam is, which is really interesting. Like that is very much the sort of perception and the fear that a lot of traditional or conservative Christians are feeling right now. And so this again sort of ties back to this idea of can religion and secularism sort of coexist. I think it depends partly on how you're defining secularism. But for me, religious freedom isn't even this idea of not just the idea of people being able to express their religious beliefs and their, engage in their religious practices, which people think of in a very narrow sense. But for me, it's more so the ability to say what we believe. Right. And that for a lot of people, not just Christians, but I think mostly Christians, they're really kind of feeling it as the more dominant religious group in this country. They're feeling that, hey, it's actually becoming almost criminal to say what we believe, that we're going to be labeled as hateful, as anti-woman, as anti-minority, as bigots. And so when I defend religious freedom, I actually absolutely come from it from this perspective of like, there's like this bigger idea here, the ability just to be able to speak. And to share our ideas openly. So in terms of, concerns by the left, I think in some ways it kind of mirrors what I just said, that Christians fear. And what I trace in the book is, and it's important, as you noted, Pastor Joel, that it's not just that I'm looking at the right. Yes, a lot of it is looking at the right because the attacks are so black and white. But there's also problems on the left that are much more subtle that I thought it was really important to bring out. And I'm like, even among those who champion Muslims' rights, they do it on very particular terms, right? It's almost like Islam is like this, ethnic or racial, grouping. And we're going to defend Muslims as racial minorities or ethnic minorities, as opposed to people who have a robust religious set of beliefs, oftentimes, very much in line with the types of conservative Christian beliefs that many people on the left have problems with.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I've as you mentioned in the introduction, Pastor, I've been a senior fellow at an evangelical Christian think tank. That's how we met for over 13, 14 years, where I spent a majority of my time defending the rights of Christians, primarily around the globe, including in Muslim majority countries. And that's informed by my background as a proud practicing Muslim. because I feel that, again, all rights need to be defended regardless of religious background. And there's no doubt that a lot of times those rights of religious practice, whether they be they be infringed by communists or by secularists, they oftentimes come sometimes from left-leaning governments because they see religion as a problem, regardless of the religion. They might be going after Christians today, Muslims tomorrow, but in general, they see religion as a threat. And because of their ardent and sometimes militant secularism, they really, again, as Asma articulated, sometimes might see, well, we can protect these Muslims right now because they're a small minority. But the moment they try to inform the public debate with their viewpoints, which might be informed or grounded in their Islamic tradition, then they have crossed the line, because now they're bringing religious practice and belief into the public arena, which again, I think our framers have guaranteed that we have the ability to express in the public arena. So that's why I think it's so important, going back to the title, particularly as we close, that Muslims, Christians, friends of the Jewish community, or people of other faiths in the country, or no faith at all, that we bring our religious viewpoints to the public arena, engage in honest public debate. And, you know, for me personally, as a Muslim American, I'm often informed by my Christian and Jewish brothers and sisters. You know, I often will look to John 4 to say, hey, when Jesus met with the Samaritan woman at the well in front of the disciples, here was a Samaritan woman who had been leading a sinful life, but he still treated her with respect. So as a Muslim, why can't I treat my Jewish, Christian, or Muslim or other faith follower, neighbor, or friend with the same respect? It goes to Matthew 5:9. I want to be somebody who is a peacemaker, because that's who God has blessed. And there are so many directions, whether it's the Jewish, Christian, or the Muslim faith, to be somebody who does enjoin peace, who enjoins friendship. And we can talk about our differences, and we can even compete in doing good things. But isn't that the best way to do it? To compete in doing good things, so that, just as you said, Pastor, we can compete to get God's salvation. We may not agree how to get there, but let's do good things in addressing the opioid epidemic, addressing homelessness, trying to find a cure for the coronavirus, or whatever it might be, to get into heaven. But let's do it as Americans, united together in one belief that we should all practice our religion freely and openly in an open and free society.
Yeah, thanks, Suhail. That actually brings me to one final here, and then I want to turn it back over to Shahed. He wants to say just a few words about AMI, and I really want to thank you guys for hosting us tonight, for providing the platform. Shahed, this has been a great conversation. One question that was directed to me, I'm assuming it was to me because it's simply worded this way: will a good American Muslim, Jew, or Hindu go to heaven? And what is the criteria? That is exactly the way to ask that question, by the way. And I think it balances well what Suhail and Asma have been talking about, that we should not fear these kinds of conversations with each other. We need to have the freedom to discuss those, and then to respect each other regardless of what conclusions we come to. So when I speak to that question, I speak as an evangelical pastor who believes that Jesus is God, who believes that every religion in the world asks a number of questions. The first one is, where'd we come from? The second one is, what's wrong with us and what's wrong with the world? Because obviously we're not all right. The third is there a solution to what's wrong with us? And the fourth is, what's our destination? And the question of who goes to heaven deals with that second and third question. What's wrong with us and what's the solution? And Christians have believed for 2,000 years that the problem is sin that separates us from God, and that the solution is the death and resurrection of Jesus. My Muslim friends do not believe that the crucifixion actually happened. And so not only do they deny that, they find it actually not to be something helpful to the practice of their own faith. I believe it. So this is one of those places where I would tell you, do you ever ask this question? That's exactly the question. And it's a question you have to answer personally. And I would just encourage you, go back to your imam. And I will say to Shahed, if that individual wants to talk with me to get the Christian perspective on this, being just perfectly honest with you, you're going to get radically different perspectives. But these are important discussions because they do deal with what happens in that next world. And I think, again, that's part of what this is all about, having the freedom to be able to talk about the next world and what we disagree on, while at the same time figuring out how to share this one and make it better together. So Suhail, Osman, thank you so much for allowing me to come in. Shahed, I hope I have earned the trust that was given to me tonight to be able to MC this. It was very gracious of you guys to allow me that. I'm going to turn it back over to you and let you close us out. And thank you all. Ramadan Mubarak to all of you who are about to break your fast in a few moments.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Pastor Joel.
Really
Yeah.
appreciate it. First of all, thank you so much to the Covenant Church and our panelists, Pastor Rainey, Asma, Suhail. I think Hurunessa has already started her iftar, so that's perfect. So first and foremost, and especially to the guests joining us tonight, it's a Friday night, like the pastor already mentioned. I just wanted to share a little bit about my background. So like all the other panelists, I was born in a different country. The country I was born in was Bangladesh, and it's predominantly a secular democracy that's Muslim. And despite being a secular democracy, my father came to this country because he wanted to express true freedom, and that's what he found in this country. And he was so grateful that after a year of being in this country, he joined the US Marines, and he wanted to give back. And I think that's a story of many, many immigrants and many Muslim Americans. And one of the things that brought us to this type of event and these types of gatherings, what we've seen in the last few years is somehow the demonization of a community. And we became concerned because, again, we have been here for quite a long time, and we have been contributing for a long time. I mean, if you go so far as to look at Thomas Jefferson, he spoke of Muslims and the potentiality of Muslims entering the highest spheres of civic life. So when we look at that historic tradition, we were wondering as Muslims, and especially as Americans, what we can do to ensure the religious freedom of all Americans. What can we do? And what we wanted to do was to reach out to different communities like Pastor Joel's, to evangelical communities, other communities, to begin to build bridges. I think one of the issues that was touched on again and again was, what is Sharia? And really, Sharia is what is our responsibility to God and what is our responsibility to people. And that responsibility is for us to know one another and to serve a broader purpose. I know there are some details in which people sometimes get confused over, and I'm happy to engage in this conversation anytime. Everyone has my email address. I'm sure Pastor Joel will share it. I'm sure the other speakers will share it. And I know today we're limited by time, but I think this is a great step in building some very necessary bridges and seeing that we have more in common than COVID-19 and quarantining. But our traditions are very much similar, whether they're civic or religious. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir. And we'll be seeing you, God willing. We're going to do this in October, sometime in the fall, and we'll do it live.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all. Have a great evening. And thanks
You
for
too.
joining us.
Good night.
Yeah.